The battleships of the Second World War provided valuable service, whether it was escorting convoys, providing bombardment support, or occasionally fulfilling their intended role of facing off against other battleships. However, occasionally, battleships explode, whether from enemy action or some other action, such as the Japanese battleship Mutsu. In today's video, we're going to look at 3 disastrous battleship losses from the Second World War: HMS Barham, USS Arizona, and IJN Mutsu. Starting with HMS Barham, arguably the most famous ship on this list globally due to the filming of her loss in combat. In late 1941, the battle raged in North Africa between Allied and Axis forces. The Mediterranean fleet, although battered and bruised from the evacuation of Crete, convoy operations to Malta, and acting in support of Allied land forces on the African continent, the fleet was out supporting land forces late in the month of November as Italian convoys were heading to North Africa with supplies for Rommel's Africa Corps and other Axis soldiers. Force K from Malta, consisting of the cruisers Aurora, Penelope, and the destroyers Lance and Lively, and Force B from Alexandria, consisting of the cruisers Ajax, Neptune, the destroyers Kimberley and Kingston, sortied to meet the Italian forces on the 23rd of November. Force K intercepted and sank the Italian convoy on the 24th of November. However, Vincent P. O'Hara, in his book The Struggle for the Middle Sea, The Great Navies at War in the Mediterranean Theater, 1940 to 1945, has this to say: "The risk involved in every sortie was demonstrated 2 days later. Admiral Cunningham, pressed by Churchill, who wired as naval commander on November 23rd, stopping these ships may save thousands of lives apart from aiding a victory of cardinal importance, had sailed with the Mediterranean fleet to support further sorties of Force K and Force B. The Mediterranean fleet was out in force, including the battleships Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Barham, while a threat to the battleships lurked beneath the waves in the form of a German U-boat, U-331, commanded by Hans-Diedrich von Tessenhausen. German U-boats in the Mediterranean were proving to be an issue, just like in the Atlantic, with their introduction in September and reinforcements in November of 1941, sinking major warships like the carrier HMS Ark Royal while she helped to deliver Hurricanes to Malta earlier in November. Von Tessenhausen was a seasoned sailor, having been on numerous U-boat patrols in the Atlantic. However, U-331 was his first command, and he had gone on several previous patrols with U-331 with little success. This most successful patrol for von Tessenhausen began from the Greek island of Salamis, where the U-boat had some work done and made its way south toward the North African coast, where U-331 was informed of the Mediterranean fleet's sortie from Alexandria and how they intended to support the disruption of Italian convoys. For several days, the boat maneuvered as destroyers moved overhead until early in the afternoon on the 25th of November, when an Italian plane flew overhead. As the U-boat surfaced at 2 p.m., faint smoke could be seen over the horizon, and at 2:41, destroyers and 3 battleships could be made out. As the distance decreased between U-331 and the oncoming British ships, von Tessenhausen ordered his boat to dive and began to maneuver his way through the screen of destroyers when, at 4:20, the now or never moment came, and von Tessenhausen had to pick a battleship to fire at. The first he could not reach a shooting position for, so he turned his attention to the second and fired a spread of torpedoes, of which 3 struck HMS Barham. U-331 was fired at and forced to crash dive to a depth well beyond what she was intended to go and survived the damage. Von Tessenhausen would go on to do more patrols until U-331 was sunk in November of 1942, surviving the sinking of his U-boat. Barham on the 25th of November 1941, on the other hand, would not. Queen Elizabeth, Barham, and Valiant were sailing in a line-ahead formation at a speed of 17 knots and zigzagging. The battleships had an escort of destroyers that were supposed to protect against submarine attack. The screen did not detect U-331 when 3 torpedoes struck Barham very close together, so close that some thought it was one large hit. There was no time for evasive maneuvers, with Valiant's officer of the watch ordering hard to port when realizing the battleship had been hit. With a ship as old as Barham and the limited amount of modernization, it's no surprise that Barham began listing to port very quickly. so much so that she was still moving forward as she continued to turn over. As the ship continued to list over and her crew tried to go over the side, Barham exploded violently, throwing men and metal into the air and having them crash down into the sea. Likely, we'll never know the exact details of the explosion. Turning to British battleships 1906 to 1946, Dr. Norman Friedman discusses the official report from the Admiralty. The torpedoes hit between the funnel and the after turrets, causing the ship to list rapidly. 4 minutes after the hits, with the ship on her beam ends, there was a heavy explosion, probably between X and Y magazines. The Board of Inquiry concluded that the torpedoes had blown in the side of the ship, causing such rapid flooding that she quickly listed to 40 degrees, paused slightly, and then rolled over. The board could not be certain of the cause of the explosion, but suggested that it was due to a fire that started in the port side 4-inch magazine, which spread to the adjacent 15-inch magazine. By the time the ship exploded, she had already capsized. The officer of the watch on the nearby Valiant stated that all observers agreed that there had been 3 explosions, 1 and then 2 in quick succession, all amidships between funnel and main mast. The general opinion at the time was that the big explosion was the 6-inch magazine, rather than A or B, as the center of the explosion was abaft the bridge. The officer thought it was forward of X and Y magazines. ADO/PCO of Barham felt 3 torpedo explosions and a 4th abreast the main mast. To take from Lieutenant Wolf, a survivor, at the time of the first explosion, I was just outside my office, which was on the port side of the ADO flat. This is the first deck above the boat deck on the bridge structure. Since I was leaving the office, I was facing aft and saw the flash of the explosion, which appeared to be immediately above the funnel. After a slight pause, 2 further explosions occurred, both slightly further aft. I crossed immediately to the starboard side, where a crowd was already gathering on the upper deck, and gave my pocket knife to a PO who was trying to unlash 2 Carly floats, which were secured at the bottom of the ladder up to the pom-pom deck. I went rapidly back to my office for my Burberry, a large overcoat, and then returned to the starboard side with some difficulty as there was already an appreciable list. I descended to the upper deck where the ship's company was already going over the side. I shouted to all near me to follow their example, rather unnecessarily as there was little panic, and the men were not wasting any time. The list was steadily increasing, and as everyone about me was over the guardrail, I went over also at the point level with the forward end of the bridge and slid down to the bilge keel. By now she was going over fast, and I reached the bottom of the ship, now an almost vertical wall. Here I hesitated, owing to the difficulty of keeping my balance because the final jump appeared hazardous, with the bottom coming to meet me. It was then a big explosion took place aft, and the ship plunged over so rapidly that I was flung backwards into the water with many others. After being sucked down, we eventually surfaced, and I swam over to a Carly float which appeared close at hand. All traces of the ship had vanished. I discarded my Burberry, blew up my lifebelt, and held on to the side of a float with many more until picked up by HMS Hotspur 1 hour later. As we saw, the final loss of the ship all captured on film, making it a uniquely tragic tale. Out of her large crew, 862 men were killed. Of these, there were 56 officers and 806 ratings, while around 400 were saved. Next, we have a Japanese battleship, IJN Mutsu. She was the second member of the Nagato class of battleships, powerfully armed with 8 16-inch guns and a top speed of 25 knots. They were certainly potent battleships. Beginning in the Second World War as part of Battleship Division 1, remaining in home waters until the Battle of Midway, where following the Japanese defeat, the battleship was deployed to Truk to take part in the Guadalcanal campaign, being little used there and returning to Japan in January 1943. Mutsu's unfortunate end came on June 8, 1943, where she was moored at the flagship buoy midway between Hashirajima and Suo-Oshima Islands, about 2 miles southwest of Hashirajima. After lunch, Mutsu's deck crew prepared to move to buoy number 2 because Nagato was expected to return at about 1 p.m. from Kure. There was a heavy fog, so visibility was down to 500 yards. Mutsu's magazines contained a full load of ammunition, including 16.1-inch Type 3 incendiary shells, designed as anti-aircraft rounds. Each round weighed around 1,853 pounds, containing 735 submunitions. Each turret magazine contained 240 shells, 120 per gun, including 50 Type 3 rounds. Taking from Mark Still in the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War, on June 8, 1943, Mutsu was at anchor at Hashirajima. Just after noon, Mutsu's No. 3 turret magazine exploded, breaking the ship in half. Of the crew of 1,474, only 353 survived, and only 13 of the 153 visiting flying cadets and instructors were saved. Initially, it was thought that the Type 3 Sanshikidan incendiary shells for the main battery turret were to blame, but tests showed that this was not the case. The final blame was conveniently assigned to a disgruntled seaman assigned to No. 3 turret who was facing theft charges. Regardless of the cause, witnesses claimed to have seen a brilliant white explosion and then Mutsu not being there anymore. Mutsu broke in two. The 535-foot forward section collapsed to starboard and sank quickly, and lies on the pagoda mast on the floor of the bay. The 147-foot stern section upended but remained afloat. Fuso immediately launched her two boats. Later, destroyers and cruisers showed up to help pick up survivors. But one interesting thing is that Turret 4 was salvaged, and her turret is now on display in Japan. As you could probably tell, finding information was a bit tough, and maybe in the future we'll cover that explosion in more detail. Finally, we come to USS Arizona, certainly the most famous in the United States. I've been lucky enough to visit her memorial, and it was truly something. Anyway, USS Arizona, BB-39, was a member of the Pennsylvania class, the second class of the standard type. Arizona entered service in 1916, and throughout the coming years of service saw many modifications. But our story with her begins on the morning of December 7th, 1941, where shortly before 8 a.m. on that Sunday, Japanese carrier attack planes and bombers supported by fighters, numbering 353 aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers, unleashed a massive attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in 2 waves, as well as nearby naval and military airfields and bases. On board Arizona, the air alarm went off at about 7:55 a.m., and the ship went into general quarters. Arizona took 2 direct bomb hits. We're taking from the excellent Naval History and Heritage Command. One of the hits that likely doomed the ship came from an 800-kilogram bomb dropped by a Nakajima B-5N2 Type 97 carrier attack plane commanded by Japanese Lieutenant Commander Kasumi Tadashi of the carrier Hiryu's Air Unit, that glanced off the faceplate of Turret 2 and penetrated the deck and exploded in the black powder magazine, which in turn set off adjacent smokeless powder magazines. A catastrophic explosion ripped through the forward part of Arizona that caused debris to rain down in the vicinity of the attack on Ford Island. Severe fires burned for 2 days. The explosion and subsequent sinking took the lives of 1,171 of the 1,512 men on board the ship. Arizona suffered more than half of the casualties of the Pearl Harbor attack. The destruction of the battleship has been described as a mighty thunderclap of sound, deep and terrible. Another eyewitness described steel fragments in the air, fire, oil, and God knows what all else. A crewman of the Arizona recalled pieces of timber, pieces of the boat deck, canvas, and even pieces of bodies. Taking from Ian W. Toll's excellent series and the first book in the series, Pacific Crucible, War at Sea 1941 to 1942, much of the Arizona was simply gone. The ship had been turned inside out, as it were, and the surviving portion of the hull sank to the harbor floor, leaving only a portion of the superstructure and muzzles of 3 guns from Turret 2 showing above the surface. Her tower and cranes leaned steeply towards the channel, and dead men hung upside down from the ladders. The blast had killed more than 1,000 of Arizona's crew in an instant, and many survivors were badly burned that their shipmates didn't know how to help them. The skin of the burned sailors has been described as completely white. The skin was just as white as if you had taken a bucket of whitewash and painted it white. Their hair was burned off, eyebrows too. They were moving like robots, it was reported. Their arms were held away from their bodies, and they just stumbled about the decks aimlessly. What of the battleship? Well, taking from Dr. Norman Friedman in his book U.S. Battleships, an illustrated guide, the case of the Arizona illustrates the general truth of war damage. The ships were often lost, not to the type of damage envisaged when they were designed, but rather to factors quite outside the normal purview of the designer. As a consequence, conventional survivability analysis may not always be relevant. The key factor in the Arizona appears to have been a small magazine holding the black powder charges for her turret catapult. Much more explosive than her 14-inch powder magazines nearby, its detonation set them off and thus led to the destruction of the forward part of the ship. This magazine, in turn, appears to have been set off by an oil fire in the ship. Thus, although in theory the magazines were protected by sufficient thickness of deck armor, a Japanese bomb that failed to penetrate the armor was able to start a fire which caused the fatal damage. As you can see in the movie clip of Arizona during the attack, a large fire, clearly involving oil, engulfed the forward part of the ship, followed only several seconds later by a magazine explosion. Army experiments had shown that smokeless propellant was unlikely to burn, but the black powder sure was likely to burn and cause the magazine explosion. The Japanese bomb that caused all of this was a converted 16-inch shell from a battleship, which I do find interesting. Hey all, important naval history from the future here. I just wanted to clarify and say there are really two main theories about what destroyed Arizona. The first is the bomb struck near Turret 2 and detonated in or near the small black powder magazine used for the ship's saluting guns and catapult charges. That would have gone off first and then set off the larger smokeless powder magazines for the main battery. This is the version Dr. Friedman leans towards. The bomb did not actually penetrate the main armored deck, but the fire and shock ignited the black powder, which then triggered the big magazines. The alternative explanation, supported by the Naval History and Heritage Command, quote, is that the bomb did penetrate the armored deck and explode in the black powder magazines, then setting off the adjacent smokeless powder magazines. There's a caveat to this, as some say the bomb directly penetrated the 14-inch magazine. Some historians also reject the older story that the bomb simply glanced off Turret 2 and caused damage outside the armor, pointing instead to one of the main theories I just discussed. The truth is, the forward part of the ship was completely destroyed, and we don't have enough evidence to say for certain. What we do know is that both the black powder magazine and the main magazine did explode. Whether ignited by fire outside the armored deck or a penetrating bomb was the trigger that doomed the forward half of the Arizona. Could this be a series? Looking at some of the disastrous losses of ships during the World Wars, or before and after. Let me know what you all think. Thank you for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it will help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.